Before we get started, a quick heads up. Presidents Unplugged now has merch. If you want to support the show and represent the podcast in your daily life, you can at presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. That is presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. Now, let's get into today's episode. Imagine being injured during one of the most famous moments in American history. On Christmas night in 1776, George Washington and his troops crossed the Delaware River in a daring mission that would help turn the tide of the American Revolution. When people picture that moment, they think of a painting with Washington standing tall in a boat, pointing confidently towards the future of the nation. What many people don't realize is that on that same mission was a 17-year-old man named James Monroe. Just days later at the Battle of Trenton, Monroe was severely wounded when a musket ball struck him in the shoulder, nearly costing him his life. While Washington was leading a revolution, Monroe was fighting right beside him. And that injured teenager would eventually grow up to become one of the most successful presidents in American history. This is the story of James Monroe. Let's do this. Born in Virginia in 1758, James Monroe lost both of his parents while still a teenager. Suddenly, he found himself responsible for family affairs and helping manage the large family estate. These hardships at such a young age forced him to mature quickly and develop the independence that would define his career. When the American Revolution broke out, Monroe left school and joined the Continental Army. At only 17 years old, he was willing to risk everything for independence, risk everything for freedom. His service and dedication during the war earned him respect and connections that would shape the rest of his career, especially in politics. After the Revolution, Monroe studied law and found himself surrounded by some of the brightest minds in young America. These were founding fathers. These were future presidents. Two men in particular saw amazing potential in Monroe: Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Both became mentors to Monroe and encouraged him to pursue public service. And with their guidance, Monroe entered politics and quickly began building a reputation as a passionate supporter for this brand new nation. He first gained experience by serving on Virginia's legislature under the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was America's first attempt at a governing system. It gave a lot of power to the states and less to the federal government, which didn't work out so well. This experience, this almost failure of early America, taught him valuable lessons about leadership and the challenges facing a brand new country. Over the next several years, Monroe continued climbing the political ladder in many different ways. He represented Virginia in various positions. He eventually became the governor of Virginia, and he even served as a diplomat to France. Now, you might think being a French diplomat is a dream. You get to eat a baguette under the Eiffel Tower and be the best Frenchman you can possibly be. First off, the Eiffel Tower wouldn't be constructed until about 95 years later in 1889. And second off, it wasn't that easy. During the time, the French people were going through something called the French Revolution, Wait, America just went through a revolution. It must be the same thing. Well, instead of a war ending in the country's independence, the French Revolution was a heinous, terrible time in French history, where people rebelled against the government and killed some of their highest leaders. Let's just say it might not have been the easiest time to be a Frenchman. Several years after being a French diplomat, Monroe's old buddy James Madison became president in 1809. Monroe joined his administration originally as Secretary of State. But soon, he found himself taking on an even larger role. During the War of 1812, the original Secretary of War, William Eustis, was inexperienced, and he wasn't doing a great job. So Monroe ended up taking over the Secretary of War position while still being Secretary of State. And while Monroe probably wishes he was over 2 cabinet positions during an easy time in American history, that was definitely not the case. The nation was still at war with Great Britain. Some of the biggest buildings in Washington, D.C. had been burned, and difficult decisions had to be made every single day. Monroe played a critical role in helping organize the nation's response to something like the War of 1812. And during this period, he gained valuable executive experience along the way. He almost seems like a future president. And after Madison completed his 8 years in the White House, Monroe seemed like the natural choice to succeed him. He was experienced, he was respected, and he was widely known throughout the country. I mean, what other man in American history has held 2 cabinet positions at once? In the election of 1816, Monroe won over 60% of the popular vote. That sounds impressive, definitely a majority, but it wouldn't even be the most dominant election of Monroe's career. Shortly after taking office, becoming the 5th president of the United States, Monroe decided to take a tour, to travel throughout the country. The president leaving D.C.? Whoa, this must be important. I mean, maybe he just wants everybody to see him. That wasn't his goal at all. Monroe's original idea with this traveling around the country business was to inspect military defenses and infrastructure, pretty much give a step-by-step idea of what he needed to work on during his presidency. But the trip quickly moved from infrastructure checkup time to something much larger. In a time before photographs, television, or social media, most Americans would never have the opportunity to see their president in person. But as Monroe traveled from town to town, crowds gathered to welcome him. We're seeing our president in person and not just a little picture in the corner of our newspapers. This was a big deal. What started as an inspection of the country became one of the earliest presidential tours in American history, and the timing could not have been better. The nation was riding a wave of optimism after the successes of the War of 1812. Even though the war ended with the Treaty of Ghent, which didn't really declare a winner or a loser, Americans still felt confident. Political divisions were few and far between. National pride was growing, and Americans felt hopeful about the future. Their morale was high. Morale is our word of the day. Morale refers to the confidence, enthusiasm, and spirit of an individual or a group of people. The time was so good, in fact, that during one of Monroe's visits, a newspaper writer in Boston described the atmosphere as an era of good feelings. That phrase caught on and eventually became synonymous with the successes of James Monroe's presidency. It wasn't a time of fear. It wasn't a time of setbacks. It was an era of good feelings. Abraham Lincoln was 6'4". Franklin Roosevelt was the president for over 4,000 days. These are facts. But you know what else is a fact? The fact that Presidents Unplugged has an Instagram page. If you want presidential content and overall updates on the show, come to the Instagram at presidents_unplugged. That is presidents_unplugged. I'll see you there. During much of Monroe's presidency, Americans felt confident about where their country was headed. Monroe oversaw significant growth during his time in office. During his presidency, Florida was acquired from Spain, expanding the territory of the United States and strengthening the nation's position in the Southeast. But challenges still existed. In 1819, the country experienced its first major economic crisis, known as the Panic of 1819. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, and many Americans struggled financially. Even during the era of good feelings, the nation learned that prosperity was never guaranteed. And Monroe also faced growing tensions over slavery and westward expansion. The Missouri Compromise attempted to maintain a balance between free and slave states. If we add too many slave states, or we add too many free states, one could overwhelm the other in Congress. So when Missouri was going to be added as a slave state, the Missouri Compromise said, hey, I'll make a deal. You can make Missouri a slave state, but you're going to have to add this new state, Maine, as a free state. It worked for the time. But here's the issue. Like many presidents after him, the Missouri Compromise only kicked the can of slavery farther down the road for the next guy to deal with. It would be one of the many compromises made in the next 40 years leading up to the Civil War, never solving the problem, just moving it on to the next guy in charge. Before listening to this episode, the one place I feel like you might have heard Monroe's name is in something called the Monroe Doctrine, arguably Monroe's most famous accomplishment as president. Announced in 1823, the doctrine warned European powers against establishing new colonies or interfering in the affairs of independent nations in the Western Hemisphere. In simple terms, Monroe argued that Europe should focus on its side of the Atlantic Ocean, while the nations of North and South America should stay on their side of the Atlantic Ocean and deal with their problems. Although the United States lacked the military power to fully enforce the Monroe Doctrine at the time, it became one of the most important principles in American foreign policy. For generations, presidents would point back to the Monroe Doctrine as a guiding principle. Later leaders such as Theodore Roosevelt and William McKinley during the time of American imperialism would use the Monroe Doctrine as justification for intervening in places like Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Panama. After all the accomplishments of James Monroe's first term, by 1820, Monroe had become so popular that election wasn't even going to be close. And I don't mean he won 60% of the vote and the other guy had somewhat of a chance. I mean James Monroe won every single electoral vote except one, coming just one vote short of matching George Washington's unanimous elections. His popularity reflected not only his leadership, but also the strength of the administration that he had assembled. Monroe's cabinet was filled with talented advisors and capable leaders, creating one of the strongest presidential cabinets in American history. As we look into James Monroe's second term, we see one of the most overlooked parts of his legacy. And it's not just in the United States, it reaches all the way to Africa. During Monroe's presidency, the American Colonization Society worked to help formerly enslaved and free Black Americans to settle in a new colony on the west coast of Africa. Monroe supported these efforts, and the settlement eventually grew into the nation of Liberia. While the colonization movement remains a complicated and debated chapter in history, Monroe's involvement and support was significant enough that the people of Liberia honored him by naming their capital city Monrovia in 1824. Whether we're talking about Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, Lake Monroe in Indiana, the city of Monroe in North Carolina, these are all named after our fifth president. And it's no surprise that many historians continue to rank his presidency among the most successful in American history because of the stability, the confidence, and the growth that defined much of his time in office. When James Monroe left the White House in 1824, the political unity that had characterized much of his presidency quickly began to fade. The election of 1824 is one of the most controversial elections in American history. After losing the era of good feelings guy, the election of 1824 featured four major candidates from the same political party, all fighting for the presidency. If you want to learn more about that story, make sure you check out my episode, Corruption and Rivalry, the Elections of 1824 and 1828. On July 4th, 1831, exactly 5 years after his buddies Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on the same day, James Monroe became our third American president to die on July 4th. You're telling me that 3 of the first 5 presidents died on July 4th? American history has some of the strangest coincidences ever. James Monroe's presidency leaves behind a unique lesson for the American story. During a time when morale was high and Americans worked towards common goals, the nation experienced remarkable growth and progress. James Monroe helped guide a young country through expansion, economic challenges, and important foreign policy decisions while giving Americans confidence in their future. More than 200 years later, his presidency remains one of the most respected in American history. His leadership was steady. His accomplishments were significant, and his impact on the United States is still felt today. And that is why James Monroe is so important. Tune in next Friday as we talk about Herbert Hoover. What a terrible president! Got us into the Great Depression, set America up for failure, and was one of the worst presidents in American history. Do you know that Herbert Hoover fed millions of children during World War I? Do you know Herbert Hoover was one of the smartest economic figures in the early 1900s? Do you know that Herbert Hoover lost both of his parents and worked his way up as a self-made millionaire in a time where that seemed impossible? Herbert Hoover saved millions of lives through his humanitarian work during his career. Maybe he's not so bad after all. Learn about that and much more next week on Presidents Unplugged. I'm Ty Svensson, and I'll see you soon. God bless. Thank you for listening to Presidents Unplugged. If you enjoy content like this, give us a follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today to be notified that your favorite presidential podcast has released new content. Now, when do we release new content? Once a month, maybe twice a year, maybe even once a year? No. We release new content every Friday at 1 p.m. for my American enthusiasts to enjoy. Come join me on our dive into making American history the most entertaining and interesting subject to learn every single week. I'm Ty Svensson, this is Presidents Unplugged, and I'll see you soon.